This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 350, Accessibility Scanning and Testing. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about accessibility scanning and testing with Mike Gifford and Daniel Mundra. Mike is a Drupal core accessibility maintainer, Civic Actions accessibility lead, and is eager to explore the limits of what can be automated with web accessibility. Daniel is a Drupal backend engineer and participates in the Civic Actions accessibility practice area. He's interested in improving how accessibility testing is included in our projects and community. Mike, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
And Daniel, welcome to the show as well.
Thank you.
I'm Nick Laughlin, and today my co-hosts are John Picozzi.
I'm back, people.
And also joining us for the third week is Mike Herschel.
I am also back, unfortunately, for all of our listeners.
We do have a module of the week this week, and we've mentioned this module before, but it's never gotten a full module of the week treatment. So this week's module of the week is editorially. Mike, can you tell us about the editorially module?
Yeah, I like editorially for a few reasons. One is that it really helps support ATAG, or the Authoring Tool Accessibility Guidelines, by trying to provide more support for authors to make accessible content. It uses the HTML code sniffer module, which is what actually comes by default in Pali, to try and evaluate the common errors that content authors run into. It's also nice to know that John Jameson, who's the lead at Princeton, they've been working with another group called SALI at the Toronto Metropolitan University, which was previously called Ryerson. So SALI is another module that does much the same thing, but Ryerson is focused more on WordPress, and so they've created something that's geared more for WordPress. But it's just nice to see the cooperation between universities and seeing open source really be a driver for innovation, and it's something that can be really useful for helping authors create more accessible content as well.
Awesome. And I do want to mention both of those. The L's are replaced with ones, the way that accessibility is often abbreviated to A11Y. So editorially and Sally are both spelled that way. So if
it is both useful and also confusing. So thank you.
Yeah, it's like the translation or the internationalization, I think. That has
or localization. Localization is LTN.
Makes me Google search it every time. Every time, have to Google it. Can't, for some reason, just can't do it.
We also have a drop-in this week. So if you have ever been to Drupal Camp Asheville or interested, give this a listen.
Mentioned that I'm also going to Drupal Camp Asheville. I've gone several years, and Asheville, for all those who don't know, it's in the mountains in North Carolina. It's just one of the prettiest parts of the country, and I like getting up there and doing all types of hiking. And the community there is really awesome, and a lot of friends. So if y'all head to Asheville, you'll see me.
Cool.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah.
So moving on to our main topic of the week, which is accessibility scanning. So we'll start with the easy question. Daniel, what is accessibility scanning and how does it differ from testing?
Yeah, accessibility scanning is essentially trying to go through all your content on the site like a user would and scanning it for errors. And you're talking about the entire site rendered, all elements rendered. And I would call it static scanning in the sense of like the scanner is not going to interact with like the form fields or elements. I think Mike will talk about a tool that does do like links and figures out all the URLs if you need to know all of them and you don't have like a sitemap. And so that's scanning, and then testing is more like getting into form fields, into more specific accessibility testing for different parts of the site.
I'd say that there's also like the side of accessibility crawling is another synonym for accessibility scanning, that they're often used interchangeably, but depending on the tool, they may have a different meaning.
So what kinds of things will this flag for you then?
Well, I mean, it generally it depends on the tests that are written. So each scanning tool may use a different set of tests to evaluate it. Most accessibility scanning tools are based on one called Axe, which is by DQ Systems or DQ Labs. But there's also other accessibility engines that can be plugged in. The tool Pally that we mentioned earlier uses HTML code sniffer, but you can swap out the accessibility engine behind it and use Axe instead. These are essentially just rule sets. They're just rule sets that look for different things. Like, is there an image without an alt text, and then it'll flag that. And it's gotten much more complicated than that. These rule sets have really evolved, and one of the goals of the DQ Axe rule set is to try and make sure that it's set up to be set up to avoid false positives. So you're not going to find yourself in a situation where errors are reported but that are not really errors. So does that make sense?
I might be dense here and just not necessarily understanding. Is accessibility scanning and testing synonymous? Are they pretty much the same thing?
Do you want to take that, Daniel?
Yeah, I would say they're definitely similar, but it's similar to, I would say it's similar to like layering your testing when you talk about unit testing, integration testing, functional testings. Like that's how I layer it. So you'd have accessibility testing would be a little bit more granular, maybe again, more feature specific, while you still want to end with accessibility scanning, which will bring up the entire site, have all the features, and then the user's content as well.
I see. So accessibility testing is like the strategy and the actual tests of what you're testing, and then the actual accessibility scanning is the practice of actually running those and scanning the product to see what's wrong or what isn't wrong.
Yep. It's also useful to differentiate between the manual tests and the automated tests, and all of these accessibility scans or crawls are using automated tests. There's no way to include manual tests in that automated process, and the automated tests are many people are familiar with the Wave toolbar as a type of automated test. But the automated tests really only cover about a third of the accessibility challenges that are part of Section 508. And depending on the thoroughness of the tester, it may be more or less. So there's as Mike can testify with Olivero, there's a lot of different ways to test the accessibility of a product, and so that 1/3 ratio for manual versus automated testing is just a ballpark figure.
So, Mike, that's actually a great segue into my next question, which you just touched on 508 compliance. I'm wondering, what's the goal of accessibility scanning, and what are some common, I guess, goal sets that people might have when they're thinking about accessibility scanning?
So the main goal is to make sure that that it's easier for websites to meet the WCAG 2.0 or WCAG 2.1 criteria, which is that's the best practice right now for establishing an accessible user interface. And WCAG 2.2 is coming out. And these are guidelines that they sort of boil down best practices. And the goal of scanning is really to make sure that we're able to go off and address the issues as early as possible. And so if we can provide as many different tools for developers to catch the issues early, then we're going to make sure that it'll be both more accessible and more robust and cost less as well. Because the last thing you want to do is do months of production on a certain feature or on a website, and then suddenly do the accessibility testing and realize you've made a mistake in the key fundamentals of the application. You need to redesign it because it was left too late. So automated testing is sort of like spell checking for your website. So it's trying to say, how do we catch the low hanging fruit? It doesn't actually tell you that you're necessarily producing an accessible site, but it demonstrates that you're not making common accessibility mistakes, and to catch it as early as possible so that there's less that we're clear on what ideally websites will be able to go off and say that they have 0 axe errors or are axe clean as an evaluation. And there aren't that many websites that are axe clean because there are often different ways for accessibility errors to get into the either the code base or into the content of the site.
Okay.
Yeah, I can agree with that, with a lot of that. So, like, what are the most popular tools for accessibility scanning? I heard you mention Pally earlier. Like, what other tool? Can you talk about that and what other tools are available?
So Pally is one of the recommended easy to install tools because it also supports continuous integration and deployment there. But the behind the scenes tool, Axe Core, is the most we would recommend, and there are a lot of libraries for Axe Core. Cypress Testing has one, Playwright, so all these testing infrastructure can call Axe. Axe is probably the best because it's the lowest amount of false positives from the scans. Other tools like Wave and all still do have false positives that you have to look into. The other thing is Axe Core is also open source and I think free to use as much as possible. I think Wave does have an API with the costs associated to it. And then Mike, you've been looking at Purple Hats.
Yeah, so we've we've definitely looked at a couple other options. I mean, one of the big ones in terms of site-wide scanning is actually SiteImprove. It's worthwhile mentioning one of the giants out there, and many organizations find that as a useful way to try and get a score that can help motivate a department to go off and to reach a certain score. But yeah, we've taken a tool that was developed by the Singapore Government Digital Services and incorporated that to do some scanning for our purposes, and have included some other functionality into that. So there's the original Purple Hats module, but we've also, on the Civic Actions accessibility site, you can find our Purple Hats site, which or our code for that, which is forked from the original implementation, unfortunately, but there's some definitely overlap in terms of how they're being implemented. But it's essentially just a site crawler that is running Axe, and going through a website, finding links, documenting those links, and then going through and evaluating them. And one of the advantages of a crawler versus something like Pally is that with Pally you generally have to either use a sitemap, or you need to provide, in one way or the other, a list of URLs that is going to go off and crawl. Whereas with the Purple Hats and some other sort of crawler-based approaches, all you need to do is put in the URL and for the homepage, and it will go through and find all the links that it can. And so it'll find more things that you may have forgotten about or may have overlooked. On the other hand, there may be pieces that are that the crawler misses that you would want to include in the sitemap, or there might be things that are there's other reasons to use a sitemap. Certainly from a speed perspective, if you just have a critical list of here are the pages that are most critical. So we want to make sure that we have the content types, the views. We want to make sure that we have landing pages. We want to have web forms. Like, we want to sort of pick out the most critical pages that are that are distinct from each other, and make sure that we're evaluating that. Well, Pally is much better at that because you can quickly come through and evaluate that. You can even build a script that goes and pulls together all that information from Drupal and provides a single list that that you could use to populate a Pally scan on a regular basis, so that whenever there's new content types added or removed from a web page, that's taken out. But it really comes down to there's a bunch of different tools, and you may want to use them in different ways in order to go off and to get the kind of impact that you're looking for, and to increase your accessibility confidence. And tools like SiteImprove, as good as they are often geared more for content people or for administrators. They're not necessarily geared for developers. So what are the tools that developers need in order to go off and take action more effectively on the errors that they're seeing?
Do any of these tools have the ability to authenticate and then run and then do the scans?
I haven't done this with Purple Hats, but I think that is part of the original implementation. SiteImprove definitely can do that. And something that they don't advertise particularly well in SiteImprove is that you can actually have, you can, with the same license for it, you can run it on the production, staging, and development environments. So you don't have to get 3 different licenses for SiteImprove. You can just get the one and make sure you're using it in every different application, so you can have that perspective.
And I believe Pally supports basic auth. Sorry.
Go ahead.
But like if you're talking about a Drupal site, that would be something you'll have to figure out how to get that authentication and then running the tool.
Awesome. So I did have a question. You guys have both mentioned a couple of times now false positives. And that's a problem with any testing. But it as a developer who pays attention to accessibility, it's sometimes baffling when you get a false positive with accessibility. And I'm curious and I'll give you an example really quickly, but I'm curious about what your process is for determining that something is an actual false positive versus a problem with the code. So for example, we're working on a project right now where we're continually getting contrast errors because it says that it can't determine what the contrast is, but it's something that has basically a black background with white text. So you can't have higher contrast than that. So it's not a contrast issue. And so we suspect it's either one of two things. It's either a false positive, or there's something making it really isn't accessible because a screen reader would have the same confusion and wouldn't be able to capture the text or something. But how do you go about determining if something is a false positive in the tool, or if it's something else that you need to remedy?
I mean, one thing to note is that Axe is an open source project. There is an issue queue. If you find something using Axe that you think is a false positive, you can report it in their issue queue. And it's worth noting that although a lot of different tools use Axe, like Google Lighthouse uses it, Accessibility Insights uses it, we've been using it in a bunch of different projects, whether it's Purple Hats or the Domain Accessibility Audit Tool, which was done by MSU, went off and created that one. It's an open source project, so you can go off and if there is a claim about color contrast, you can or other issues that you think are not accessibility issues, you can post them, and they do prioritize false positives because they realize just how much money is wasted trying to chase down these false positives. But it is tricky with images in that there's often challenges in terms of saying, well, where is this? Is this a black background that is determined through CSS, which is if it's a simple sort of CSS foreground background issue, it's usually pretty easy. But maybe it's got a black, maybe there's a white CSS background, but there's a black image on top of that, and then it's like, well, which one do we use? And it's visually you can see which one it is. It's pretty easy, but from a perspective of a developer, it's harder. From the perspective of a tool, it's harder because it doesn't necessarily know which one is better. Although Firefox has a color contrast tool within its developer extension, which is better for this. And in fact, the Axe Dev Pro tool, I think, has just recently released that color, the same sort of level of color contrast checking within their Pro tool, which is not the same as the open source tool.
Okay.
It's similar,
I'll have
but
to
there's
take a
more
look.
features in the Pro version.
I'll take a look at that. So getting back to our agenda, and getting back to this podcast, Talking Drupal, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't ask, does Drupal have any modules or services specifically that help with accessibility scanning on the Drupal side?
One thing I would recommend, like off the top, is like turning on the sitemap module, or one of them, right? That will help all types of scanning, because then you have a set of URLs. You can just give the scanner and you start running. You'll have to otherwise rely on a scanner that can know and figure out all the links and crawl through the site. Turning on the sitemap is something that will just make it easier. For Pally, I think most scanners take in an input of a sitemap. So doing that off the top definitely help. Mike and I recently became maintainers of Accessibility Scanner module, which essentially allows you to give it a set of URLs in a Drupal site and run acts on the server side, and then produce the results on the Drupal site. It's handy to at least either test your own site or test even other sites and bring the results in a place that's easier to follow and follow this. It supports a cron job, so it can run on a weekly basis and then keep showing you the results and differentiate the results from week to week. We're looking forward to diving in more and seeing what more we can do as new maintainers. And then editorially, as you mentioned, the module of the week is one of the top ones.
Tenon has a plugin that allows you to go off and to use that one as well. Site Improve also has a Drupal module that you can use, and if you are using Site Improve for your Drupal, if your site's using Site Improve, you might as well install the Drupal module, because it'll help your authors be able to assess more where those problems are. So those are a couple options as well. And actually, just one piece about the accessibility scanning tool module that Daniel and I are now maintainers of, which is sometimes that happens in Drupal, but one of the things about that was really nice about it is it has the ability to go off and track a history, so you can see how accessible is your site now versus the last time the site was used. It uses the archive module to try and provide the ability to see change. And one of the big things about accessibility is it's not really important that you're perfect. It's important that you're part of a journey, and that every time you're working to be more accessible today than you were previously. So how do you build that journey into the process?
So I know, shifting from Drupal, and we'll get back to Drupal because, again, this is Talking Drupal, but I know Nick and I are actually both working on projects right now that use a component library called Storybook. And we're wondering, and I think Nick's used this, I think I've used it as well, but have either of you guys used the accessibility add-on in Storybook? And if so, how do you find it works? Do you think it's a good thing? Do you think it needs some help?
I'm hoping you've done this, Daniel.
No, I'm not. I've used Angular and other component libraries. I'm glad to see that there is an add-on that at least makes sure that your UI components are accessible. That essentially is like unit testing at that level of component, instead of waiting for the entire site to be working. So I'm glad to hear it, at least.
So Storybook has an accessibility add-on that runs acts tests against each component automatically. And it's a JavaScript based project, so it's one of those things where it has like hot reloading, so you can literally change things on the fly and see what happens. It incidentally is also the tool that's giving that possible false positive, which is why I was curious if it was something you were familiar with. But it's using Axe in the backend, I think, and it links directly to the DQ guidelines and stuff that Axe is using. So it's really helpful in resolving those. But it's one of the reasons why one of my clients chose Storybook as a base, because it has that built in. I mean, you can configure it, but as a developer, it's one of those things like I include it and I have a base level of accessibility testing automatically everywhere. I didn't have to do anything or add any additional tools. I just included the plugin.
Another tool that some developers don't know about is Visual Studio also has an Axe linter that you can just add into it. So if you're already using Visual Studio, it's really nice to be able to extend the capacity by adding in this Axe linter. And again, the earlier you catch the issues, the easier it is. My one concern about any add-on or plugin for accessibility is that only a fraction of the people using the tool are going to be using the accessibility plugin. So how do you try and build in the default so that it's actually normal for everyone to go off and use it? Maybe they should be enabling the plugin by default, and you can disable it if you want to, but by default it's enabled, because who wants to be producing inaccessible component libraries? Like that doesn't make any sense. And yet that's not the default for most organizations. Most people, it's like, oh, let's add this as a nice to have after the fact.
Yeah. And then it's always cut.
Yeah.
Because they get to it and they realize, oh, we have to completely redo the brand identity colors because they're inaccessible with each other. There's not enough contrast, and you can't justify changing the entire design of the system, when you're launching in 6 weeks or something. So
that's right.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So switching topics a bit, can you talk about VPAT, voluntary product accessibility templates, and what that is, and why would I want one?
So I argued for a long time against producing these VPATs for Drupal, and because it seemed like a lot of marketing that wasn't necessary, and seemed to be, as for somebody that's not based in the US, is like, well, this is a US specific thing. Why would anyone want to go after do this in the Drupal community? That changed suddenly when we needed to go off and produce a VPAT for a client who wanted to have a VPAT for Drupal. So I was like, okay, well, I better make one up. And doing it as I did, I decided like it would be useful to go off and to create one that was open. And so I did it in GitHub, and started with Markdown, and it's like, how do I try and build up something that's as simple as possible, so that rather than building something that is a Word-based document, I can have something that was more machine readable. And theoretically, the VPAT it's really potentially a really useful part of the Section 508 process. It's about trying to put more pressure on vendors to build accessibility in. It's about trying to take the incentive, using the power of the marketplace to incentivize vendors to build in accessibility. Like, that's what it's there for, is to make it so that vendors are building in accessibility, because there's a competitive advantage for especially when selling to government or to educational institutions, but increasingly to financial institutions and others. Unfortunately, the VPAT is a format that has been abused over time, and it's not necessarily kept up with the needs for software development. And so we've seen that there's an opportunity to go off and to go beyond the VPAT structure, to be able to say that we can encourage we can encourage a more modern approach, not using a word. I mean, VPATs are essentially a Word document based approach to accessibility conformance, and that isn't the best practice in security. It's not a best practice in accessibility. It's not a best practice in anything in that is a digital first implementation. So that's.
I want to clarify my understanding of a VPAT and make sure I understand the goals of it, right? Because you originally said that you were not a big fan of them, but I've seen their.
Before you do, John, can you clarify what a VPAT is still? Because I'm still not clear on what exactly.
So that's where that was kind of my question, right? Was like, my understanding of a VPAT is that it is essentially a document that outlines the inadequacies in accessibility for the site or product. And the main use for that may not necessarily be useful for the greater community, but from a legal standpoint, sometimes it's useful to say that, hey, we know that there's this accessibility issue, and that we are working to try to resolve it. Right? Is that the general gist of the VPAT document?
Yeah, I mean, it's in general, the more sort of general approach for this is called an accessibility conformance report. So it's about trying to identify the strengths and weaknesses and the workarounds that are required as part of this a part of the software that's being sold. And if the developers and designers were actually implementing this properly, and many of them are, like if you look at the big vendors like Microsoft and IBM and others, like their VPATs are probably really excellent for what they accomplish. But most VPATs are written by the sales team or reviewed by lawyers. So maybe they're produced by a good team like DQ or Level Access or TPGI, but they're then reviewed by the sales team before they get sent off to, or say the sales or legal before it gets sent off to the client. So it's the legal process, the legal concerns in the US really sort of fuddle things, because there are lots of organizations who are afraid about actually putting in full disclosure around accessibility into their ACRs or their accessibility conformance reports, because they're afraid of that being used against them in the court. So although it is an incentive to go off and to say that to put forward your accessibility claims and say you're all accessible, there's not really that many incentives to go off and to talk about all the places where you fail, because the courts really don't care.
Yeah.
They just need it to be Section 508 compliant, plain and simple.
Yeah, it's interesting. The first time I came in contact with a VPAT, it was actually a client requesting an audit and the production of that document, because they were either in the process or had the fear that they were going to be litigated against, and they wanted to be able to say, like, but here's the document that says, like, we know that it's an issue and we're working to fix it. So
right. And in fact, VPATs have been misused in a lot of ways too. Like they're not really good for that type of thing. They're designed as a sales document, and if they're part of the procurement process, that makes sense. There's a much better tool called WCAG-EM that was produced by the World Wide Web Consortium's Web Accessibility Initiative that actually does a better job of outlining how to do an evaluation of an existing live website. And VPAT should not be used for in the case that you described. That's an inappropriate use of it, because it doesn't. There's no common methodology behind it that allows you to go off and say, what was tested? Is it just one page, or is it all the pages? Is it like, how is this being done? What does this reflect?
So the VPAT is something used in the sales process to say, this is where you stand now. This is what we'll address to get you to accessibility guidelines 2.1 or whatever.
It's a collection of all the known issues, and it goes beyond the web as well. Like for the US, most of it is tied to Section 508, which is still tied to WCAG 2.0. But there's an international standard that addresses 2.1 and will be addressing 2.2 when that comes out. There's also looking at other aspects of Section 508. So whether it's your kiosks or your digital phones, like all digital tools fit within Section 508. It's not just the web.
Okay.
Let's talk a little bit about OpenACR. Daniel, can you tell us what OpenACR is?
Yeah, so OpenACR, Open Accessibility Conformance Report, essentially, as Mike mentioned, the VPAT was a Word document. Everyone takes it and they format it and reshape it however they want. If you're looking at two pieces of software, you're going to have two different VPATs, differently ordered, but the same main points, like which accessibility criteria they are satisfied, which one they need work on. We wanted to take all of that and turn it into at the bare bone, a JSON schema, so that everyone is essentially, however they're writing it, they're still making sure that they are matching all the WCAG 2.0, 2.1 criteria. They are following a standard option, like whether they are satisfied, whether they are not evaluated. And that's what we came up with OpenACR together with the GSA. Civic Actions worked with the GSA on like coming up with the schema, and then coming up with options of how someone would edit the schema, right? Because you don't want to be editing just pure JSON. We settle on like a YAML format, but then an editor online where users can go in there, fill in their OpenACR, take their old VPAT, fill in an OpenACR, and then generate an HTML one if they wanted to put on their website and make it pretty and match their styling. But still, they can then deliver an OpenACR to the client or to the government, which the government can easily look and review. Are they meeting all the criteria? Where are their failings? Are they working on it? What are the notes related to it? And hard to say, but like also then looking at maybe comparing it more easily between other pieces of software. Instead of Word documents, you can use these YAML files to really look at how is exactly one criteria being done across multiple software.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, that comparison piece is really quite important, but also even like the enterprise-wide piece, like the knowing, I can say with confidence that there's no government agency that knows all of the barriers that their current software is presenting for their staff, because there's no central way to organize that. Even if you had all the VPATs together in a directory that a government department is using, you wouldn't have a way to go off and to search through those and be able to access those, or even just to make sure that those files are up to date. How do you make sure that the VPAT that you've downloaded from the client is the same as the version of the software that you're running right now? And that ability to have version control that keeps up with the software development, the software implementation cycles, rather than the sales cycles, is something that is currently missing with the VPAT. Because really, like, software changes all the time. You can't assume that the software you buy today is the same as the software that you're going to be using after you've implemented it. Yeah.
So OpenACR replaces VPAT, and like how does it do this? Is this something that people know about yet, or are you, well, like, what's the next step to make this happen?
So we did make it, everything is open source. The schema is all on GitHub, the editors all on GitHub.
Okay.
It's owned by the GSA, so the process right now is, the hope is that when the GSA is procuring software, they will request the vendor. Previously, they would say, like, give us your accessibility conformance reports, use the VPAT template. They'll switch to say, like, use the OpenACR template to produce the ACR document and turn in a YAML file, and if you want, also an HTML file. But really, it's the YAML file that they'll be asking for. That's a hope. It's right now on the shelf per se. So Mike has still been like talking to GSA and like getting Section 508 to really buy, and they recognize that the procurement end to end needs to be looked at. And OpenACR or the VPAT is just one part of that conversation.
But if you're asked to go off and produce a VPAT for a client, you can use OpenACR to produce that VPAT, and you can just send them the HTML document if you want to. You can also just print to PDF if you want to, or copy and paste that text into a Word document and have a properly structured document that you can then use as part of that. So there's nothing to stop you from using the VPAT, using OpenACR right now to produce a VPAT style document.
Exactly.
But it's not technically using the VPAT template because we've added some other things to that. That being said, almost everyone takes the VPAT template and modifies it as they want to fit their styling and to adjust things as they prefer. So there's a lot there's very few VPATs that are strictly conforming to the ITI's VPAT format.
And to add to that a little bit more, one of the things we wrote was not just the schema, but a big part of it is we wrote a validator that validates whether you have filled in, or it's giving you prompts saying that you're missing these WCAG criteria that you haven't mentioned. Please fill those out. That is the main part, and that's the main part in the editor. It gives you exactly all the fields. So in the Word document, you could skip over sections, you could ignore pieces. The editor is trying to like make that better, where you're not skipping all those sections and you're at least covering every part of it.
So you mentioned that you wrote a VPAT for Drupal for a client. Is there an OpenACR for Drupal? Is there like a template you can start with?
There is, yes, and so that's both on the GSA's OpenACR site, as well as Civic Action has one as well. And so if you do a search for it on GitHub, you'll find probably both of them. And they do need to be updated. Like they're like everything, it changes. And so one of the hopes is that we'll actually look at the I would like to go off and have the Drupal accessibility issue queue be broken down by WCAG success criteria. So it would be possible to go off and to build a tool to scrape all of the open accessibility issues in a current version of Drupal, and then be able to get a list of known accessibility issues to start with. And then maybe even to have a section whereby we're putting into the project description, or sorry, not the project description, in the issue description, what we put into the VPAT. So there's an easy way to sort of copy and paste and to identify what are the descriptions that are part of the OpenACR, not VPAT, but what are the descriptions that are part of the OpenACR that we're putting into the infrastructure. But there's a lot more that needs to be done to make that happen.
So let's jump into the accessibility testing side of things a little bit, and let's ask the really broad question: how should one tackle accessibility testing? Do you have and to lessen the scope of this question, do you have I don't know, your top 3 tips for how somebody should start to tackle this?
Top 3 tips, I would say definitely use the browser-based extensions like Wave, Axcore in your browser. So when you're building things, when you're looking at the site, you're looking at whether your feature is working, but you're also then just clicking a button and looking that your feature is accessible. Doing that's the first tip. I would say, and then bringing it to the next thing, which is adding it to acceptance criteria. That means maybe a QA testers are involved and they're also doing the same thing. They're testing to make sure your feature is accessible. So you're not, the definition of done includes that. So your tasks are checking for that, and then you're marking it done when it's actually accessible. And then encouraging even when you talk about usability testing, when a user is getting in there, finding different sets of users who can test your sites, right? Test your features, right? Encouraging to go out and find users who have disabilities to take a look at your site, giving you feedback on it, and then working it back into your backlog of things to fix. Doing that sooner. Sorry, Mike.
Just the whole aspect of getting feedback from people with lived experience of disabilities is really quite important, because it's as much as I can do testing to understand what it is like to operate a screen reader, a blind user is going to have a better lived experience. And in fact, there's multiple blind people who will configure their assistive technology in multiple different ways. So you might get different experiences or different feedback if you're engaging with different screen readers or different screen reader users. But one thing that I definitely recommend is that, automated testing is certainly the easiest thing, and having something that's in your browser so that you can go off and test that out. Making sure that it's something that everyone has as part of their browser. At Civic Action, we have we actually, as part of the onboarding process, we ask people to install the Wave toolbar, and we go through a basic training of that so that everyone knows the basics of how to go off and to use the Wave toolbar. And we use the Wave toolbar mostly because it's just the easiest for people who are non-technical to understand. And so it's a sort of a low-hanging fruit for that. For more technical people like developers, either using the Axe Dev Pro tools is what we recommend, or accessibility insights from Microsoft. But that's part of it. And then but keyboard only testing is also something that everyone can do. It takes very little training. Macs might need to go off and do a little bit more training to go off and learn how to configure their Macs so they can do keyboard only training or keyboard only testing. But it's something that can be done from that side. And also, if you're looking for a firm to go off and to help with testing with people with disabilities, I recommend Fabletech Labs as a really innovative company that has done a lot in the last couple of years to to make it easier for people to get access to high quality testing with people with lived experience of disability as part of your development cycle. So that's another thing to include.
That's pretty awesome. I've heard of Fabletech before, and my understanding is that they hire real people with disabilities and pay them money to do testing. Am I right on that?
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And if you watch some of the videos from Samuel and Alwar and Abdi, there's some really they've got some great stuff that they've contributed back to the community, and that they're helping to raise the level of accessibility for everyone. So definitely recommend them.
It's pretty cool. So how do we automate all this? How?
That's yours, Daniel. Go for it.
Yeah, I see that laugh right there. I just like check a box, right? It says, "Do all this for me."
We're clearly asking all the easy questions today.
The way I would say automated is like, it's layered. It's very, very similar to like unit testing and that layers. You want to, I like Cypress for our unit testing, and it's not really unit testing. I like Cypress for at least functional testing that way, which does have an Axe library where you can then add your accessibility test to it. So it's layering that. You put in Pally testing. So you're testing the entire site as well. The caveat there is even DQ mentioned this automated testing will get 20 to 50%. So it's
Is that low?
Yeah.
I was hoping for a little bit higher. I didn't expect 100%, but like for example, can you actually clarify something for me? When you say 20 to 50%, is that 20 to 50% of global accessibility, or even like functional things that you could test? So for example, automated test isn't going to catch whether or not an alt tag is actually descriptive of the image, at least not yet, right? So it can't catch that. It can't catch a lot of content level things. But is that 20 to 50% thing applied to even things like contrast, or
Yes.
or is that the breakdown? Oh, really?
Yeah, because I mean, it depends on how the contrast is being done, but it's increasingly difficult to do that. I mean, color theory on its own is really quite complicated. And are you talking about transparencies? Are there gradients involved? I mean, that's even before you start talking about images in the foreground or the background, because they're being used in both now, right? So you can't just assume that the image is used as a background and that you can address it. So that people are looking for all kinds of ways to add additional texture to this. But one way to try and to simplify this is to make sure that you're starting with a good design system that is being tested for accessibility. If you're starting with something like Olivero as your base theme, and you're extending beyond that, you're going to be much more accessible than if you try and start something from scratch, or you start with a design system that looks funky but has had no accessibility testing. People who start with Olivero, or in fact any Drupal core theme, are benefiting from thousands of hours, literally, of people going through and reporting errors and bugs and working through different combinations of solutions that allow us to go off and to address different issues. So if you start with a good design system, you're going to catch many of the issues that you're not going to be aware of through the testing. And you'll be much better off if you start with that, and that will include things like keyboard only testing as part of that as well. How do you make sure that you're able to make sure that when you're doing the testing that you're not just dealing for at that single interface of a desktop and a mouse. There are more and more people using tablets. There's more and more people using all kinds of voice level control. So it's not just screen readers, but also like how are you engaging with Alexa and Siri when those user agents are interacting with your website? And so thinking more holistically about the way that all kinds of users are engaging with your content.
I want to back up to the automated testing. There was a blog post a while ago, and it recently got updated, where someone decided, I want to build the worst accessible website that passes all the automated tests.
Yep.
And so the person just did everything and made it completely inaccessible. But if you run the automated scans on there, it completely passes. And you're talking about color theory. Like I read an update to this, like with CSS, you can change like the opacity of the text and things like that. So they were doing that initially to kind of lower the contrast, and the tools wouldn't catch that. But now the tools do catch that. But there's still a million ways. So now they're using the CSS filter property with opacity, and now and so there's ways to always there's ways to always kind of mess up the automated tools.
Right. Color contrasting specifically, is definitely evolving and much more harder problem. I think more of the other automated testing, it really then becomes how clever you want to be and how much time you're allowed to write really good tests, right? In terms of like my quintessential example is like form fields, right? Or something that's interactive. A scanner that's just testing an entire page is only going to just run it and check the page. But you want to write a test that actually goes and like touches your form field, puts it in focus, and then checks whether that now is accessible or is it not accessible. If something's a modal, click on it and then check whether it's accessible. So it's like really investing that time to write these tests that it's similar to you're testing the feature, right? Making sure that it is doing what it's supposed to do based on your code. Add to it another test that says, is it also accessible at the same time? So I think adding one solution is like combining it with your regular tests anyway, right? Just encouraging more test-driven development.
And if you're not sure, I mean, especially if you're looking at web forms in the web form module, I mean, reach out in the issue queue, ask questions. Jacob's being incredibly forward thinking about his addressing accessibility and in fact the sustainability of the web form module. But if you run into problems with that, or in fact with core, if you can submit an issue and describe it well and identify how to replicate it, then it's something that really can help, especially if you're able to point to something like this, provide a patch or a sample of code, or something something to help evaluate this.
And to your comment, Mike, about beating the accessibility testers, right? You can write like bad unit tests to some extent that just always pass, right? Like at the end of the day, it just says like if I assert true is true, and so there's always ways to beat it. So it really becomes up to us, right, as like authors, like how we want to do it, and then reviewing each other's code and being like.
My goal as a front-end developer is to beat the accessibility test in any way possible. I say that as a joke.
So speaking of beating the accessibility tests and making it more difficult for people to do that, people like Mike to do that, I guess I should say. I'm wondering if that's something that we can add into our CI/CD process and kind of make that a gate where, hey, you made a change to the front end UI, we'll spin it up in a CI/CD workflow and like, hey, Mike, guess what? You can't do that. I know you're trying to get around it, but you can't. You got to fix it. Is that something that you guys have seen, and is that something easy to do?
Definitely. With the Pally has a CI feature on it, and sorry, got some noise in the background. Apologies. Pally has some accessibility testing that will run in your CI and it will produce results, and then you can have it so that causes, if it's a failure state, then it's going to fail. Then Cypress can be added to your CI/CD pipeline with the Axe testing, and again, it will be showing you whether it's failure, and it will fail your pipeline as well. To Nick's point, right, he's running into the contrast issues. That's where you have to be like, is it false positive? Maybe I have to like escape it. You have to like put it in the ignore rules for now, let the CI/CD pipeline pass, and then come back to really adjusting it later on.
Yeah.
But we really should be setting so that there are no axe errors as part of a commit. We should be setting up as a practice that that's just something that is not something that is allowed to get into our projects. And it's worth noting that Jesse Beach and Kevin, I'm forgetting Kevin's last name, they had developed in Drupal 7 a test swarm that for accessibility that tested core against accessibility issues, and using a different the Quail.js library, which is incidentally what CK Editor currently uses for their accessibility plugin tool, even though it isn't really being actively maintained at the moment. But there's a it's worthwhile to try and think about how to go on and to stop people from addressing what are your goals, and if the site has already got lots of accessibility errors in it, you're not going to be able to say no axe errors can be introduced. You might need to say that no new axe errors have been introduced, and actually have a more complicated structure to evaluate the number of axe errors from the last test and compare it to the number of axe errors from the current test. But that's
yeah.
Mike,
I mean, in my case, we need to figure out how to solve it, because to a further point, this particular project is a design system, and we're handing this design system off to other developers to maintain. So if they see code in there that says, hey, ignore these, this is how you ignore a test, then tests will just get ignored. Whereas if we find a way to get it to pass without any tests being ignored, that can be a stipulation. Like, it has to pass Axe, and you can't ignore tests in order to let them pass. So we're making that a requirement to deliver the product.
Mike, since we talked about a little bit about like accessibility gates, do you want to maybe talk a little bit about Drupal core's accessibility gates, since you're one of the core maintainers?
Yeah, well, Drupal has since Drupal 7, Dries announced it. I forget which DrupalCon it was, that there were 4 performance gates. One was performance and security, and there was a UI UX performance gate and accessibility. Those were the 4 gates I think that were announced. And there have been a number of times where the Drupal core has been essentially being held up because of accessibility issues that were identified, that as a community we took on the responsibility to try and address. And that was not without some significant compromises that needed to be made from just the delivery timelines for the project. One of the big ones was the implementation of inline form errors with Drupal 8. And there's actually I forget who the maintainer is of the inline form errors module, but it's something that was huge, and in fact still is huge. And I think that there's still more that should be done to try and make sure that is actually built by default, and that the inline form errors module is enabled by default for core. It hasn't been done. That we haven't pushed to make sure that is implemented as part of the defaults in Drupal 9. But the inline form errors is a critical part of WCAG. It's the ability to go up and make sure that when a user completes a form, if there's an error in the form, that user is able to understand what the error is about, and is able to respond and effectively address that. But again, because it was something that Drupal had already been around for probably 15 years by the time we tried to add that in, there was a lot of code to go into to rethink and reorganize. So it was a huge process to rethink that and to include accessibility in after the fact, which again just highlights the importance of trying to make sure that accessibility is being built in from the start, and that we're not waiting for this to be something that is added in after the fact.
So as we bring the show towards the close, are there any really big gaps in automated testing? So you mentioned it only covers 20 to 50%. How do you make sure you're aware of what gaps there are and make sure that you address those with other avenues?
Some of the gaps I know off the top of my head are like tab indexes are there. They're reasonable, but they're there, but they're not, are they accurate? Are they really allowing the user to flow through the fields, through the links? Really, it's like manual testing is one of the best ways to solve it, right? We've spoken about contrast quite a bit. You mentioned alt text. You don't know if they're really representative of the image or of the figure on the screen. A lot of our scanning does talk about ARIA quite a bit, and it's just scans and checks and make sure that your ARIA using the labels appropriately. And so there's discussions about, well, do you need ARIA also? Can you like not have it, or if you need it, whether you're doing it? So you might have to rely on reviewing the ARIA standards, making sure it's easy following that quite a bit.
I think the area one is really huge because, I mean, I think this is still relatively a new standard. There's some WA web accessibility initiatives, accessible rich internet applications code within Drupal 7. But we really started adding it in Drupal 8 because the standard hadn't been fully released by Drupal 8. So it was a it was a huge advance to go off and start having all access to this additional semantics for rich interactive content. So that was great, but still people are using it incorrectly. It's great to it's like if you're any cyclists here who know about the a wheel truing tool. It's just a little tool, and it's you with this little tool you can tighten and loosen your spokes in order to go off and to make sure your wheel's nice and smooth and not all wobbly. But it's the most dangerous tool on the bike because you can if you don't know how to do it properly, you can easily pretzel your bike wheel. It's much more complicated to go off and to use that little wheel the spoke truing tool than you'd think. And so the first rule of ARIA is don't use ARIA. So if it can be done with HTML, do the semantics with HTML, and use ARIA when you can't use ARIA. And there are certain kinds of semantics that you can't define with ARIA. So the ARIA landmarks are an example of that. For example, ARIA Live is another space where it isn't being used, or where you can't replicate content that's being added to a page after the fact with ARIA Live. So that's another sort of space to sort of think through and to say, well, how do I include semantics that describes to a screen reader what is actually happening on the page, because I've just added a new element here, and that's something that a screen reader user may not know about. Nor, for that matter, would VoiceOver would Alexa or Siri or any of these other voice controlled interfaces. They're not going to know about that new content that's being added to the page unless you tell them about it. So I wanted to just to touch on those issues, and like tabbing to the page is definitely a huge one. Like there's you can probably find an additional third of the errors just by going off and tabbing through a web page and making sure that it is following a logical order from top to bottom, left to right for Western languages. Of course, if you're dealing with Arabic or Hebrew, it's not quite the opposite, but it's from right to left instead of left to right. And so think about that. And finally, I just realized that we hadn't actually talked about the GAD pledge that happened. So the Global Accessibility Awareness Day took place on May 19th this year, and the Drupal community signed the GAD pledge, which means we are now one of three different projects that have completed this. So the first one was React Native, the second is Ember.js, and now Drupal, and hopefully there'll be more coming in the future. I think it's certainly been useful to go off and have that, and there will be a number of changes to the documentation, which we're hoping will again step up our commitment to accessibility over time. So that's something that I wanted to make sure to announce here as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Daniel and Mike, for joining us. This has been an extremely interesting show, as usual. Whenever we talk about accessibility, there's always stuff to learn, and we thank you for jumping on.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Do you have questions or feedback? Reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or via email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel. If you're interested in show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and Chad's book corner, sign up for our newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and choosing the Become a Patron button.
And Mike G, if listeners want to get in touch with you, what would be the best way?
The easiest way to reach out to me is on Twitter. I'm at mgifford on Twitter, but I'm also mgifford most places like Drupal.org. You can also reach out to me there. And you can find me on the accessibility page for Civic Actions as well, accessibility.civicactions.com.
And Daniel, how about you?
I think probably, I don't know what social media is. I have nothing. I would say like GitHub is my social media, so you can always bring me into a pull request and I will respond.
Sounds good. And Mike H, how about you?
I'm just going to open up a pull request and say hi. You can find me on Twitter at Mike Herschel, and you can email me at mike@herschel.com. And I hope at some point soon I'll have a new version of my homepage at herschel.com launched. We'll see about that.
Nice. And John, how about you?
You can find me on all the major social networks at John Picozzi, as well as Drupal.org. And you can find out about EPAM at epam.com.
And you can find me pretty much everywhere at Nixvan, NICXVAN.
If you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking.
Thank you.